I know that there were a lot of people who were interested who couldn't just make this time. So thanks everybody for taking the time for this really, really important conversation. Denice and Chris have been working on this issue for a while, and both Chris from his previous work in the census and Denice at her seat now at Georgetown at the Beeck Center. That most of you have met her from being an NNIP alumni before. And there was, I'll just start with saying very big news yesterday that I'll forward around, setting the epsilon for the redistricting file, which they set considerably higher than the demonstration products in relation to what they had. The demonstration projects were at around 12, and this was around 19 was the policy set. So I think that showed the real impact that stakeholders can have. Stakeholder pushing back on the quality level of the data from the current piece where Leah's going to need an we can go. I'll forward the information.
That really didn't mean anything to me. You're gonna have to explain the significance of it.
Okay, I'll send a separate note. But basically, they're gonna in the balance between masking the data and accuracy of the data, they leaned more towards accuracy than they had previously before.
Thank you.
So, which is either good news or bad news, depending on where you sit and what your bigger concerns are. Some of the people on my committee were dismayed about going the right direction. But anyway, either way, the point was that that user feedback through different channels, both informal and formal, I think can make a real difference in the Census Bureau right now. And we'll also note that someone from Urban, Rob Santos, is the proposed census director. I don't think it's gone through yet, but he'll go through confirmation hearings, but he's really amazing and a good ally for data users. So I'll turn it over to Chris and Denice.
All right, thanks. Super excited to be here. Denice, did you want to kick it off?
Sure. Hi, everybody. And big shout out to Allison Flyer, who could probably give this presentation herself. Allison and I were longtime colleagues at the data center in New Orleans. So it's great to see so many familiar faces. Just for background, since about 2017, I started to get worried about the census, the decennial, and what we might do if this decennial census goes off the rails. So we started convening what we call the Census Quality Reinforcement Task Force, and it's a multidisciplinary group of stakeholders, including historians and data scientists and civil rights experts and former census staffers and stakeholders of all types who were looking to see will the census data be fit for use? And if not, how will we know? And what can we do about it? And it turns out that the Bureau does have a few processes for appealing the final counts. Not many processes, and they're very narrow. And so today, Chris will talk mostly about the POP-S Challenge program, which historically has yielded the most increase in counts for jurisdictions that appeal. But I wanted to start with a little bit of context about what those three appeals processes are. The first one is called count question resolution. And it was originally slated to begin after the delivery of the redistricting data. As you probably know, the final redistricting data with the toolkits and everything will be released September 30th. And so it was originally slated to start in October 2021. I suspect that will be delayed. And the count question resolution has very narrow criteria related to technical data processing issues. So there hasn't been a lot of yield on additional counts through count question resolution. But the good news is that to Kathy's point about the Bureau being being really good at listening this time around, especially because of all of the, the challenges that this Bureau had with the pandemic and politicization and hurricanes and fires and other headwinds. There is a possibility that with public input, the criteria for count question resolution might be expanded just because of these extraordinary times this decade. I encourage you to keep an eye out for the Federal Register notice. Probably will land in September of this year to supply some comments about why you might want this opportunity to use the count question resolution process. The nice thing about CQR is that if you have a successful appeal, that the new count then gets incorporated into the population estimates and the ongoing American Community Survey throughout the decade, so it automatically gets rolled in. The Population Estimates Challenge Program, which Chris will be talking about, that generally begins after the release of the 2021 population estimates. So in between each decennial every year, there's a population estimate. And those, the 2021 population estimates will be released in 2022, and then every year thereafter. So jurisdictions have just 90 days to submit a challenge there for PopS challenge. And that program tends to have broader criteria that Chris will talk about. And then lastly, often when people think about the census not being the best one it could be, they think about like, well, we need a redo or a special count. That makes intuitive sense, although there is an opportunity for jurisdictions to request a special census, but the governmental unit requesting that special census has to pay for it. And it's very expensive. So for example, in 2017, the city of Washington, Illinois, which has a population of around 15,000, they asked for a partial special census. And the Bureau estimated that for a partial census of 15,000 people, it would cost $114,000. So that's a lot of money. And you also, if you have a special census, you don't get the benefit of all the operations to get out word about filling out the forms. So the various outreach campaigns won't be happening at the same time. So you could end up with a lower count than you got for the decennial. Next slide, please. And so I want to dive in a little bit to just show you what the historical results for count question resolution have looked like. So you can see those measly numbers on the far two right columns. These are just for the states that submitted count question resolution challenges after 2010. And so Alabama got a whopping 17 extra people. Arkansas got 1 extra person. The leading state was Georgia, which increased their total number by 197. So Kathy's right, it just isn't worth the effort. And I mentioned it's very narrow technical criteria. Generally what it is, it just ends up moving counts between different geographies. So in the, and I don't know the answer to Boston, but there's very little yield. The PopS challenge does have better numbers though. Let's go to the next slide. What we see here is the number of successful population estimate challenges on the left is the number of population estimate challenges that were successful, and on the right is the average percentage change in population. So you can see that the heyday really of PopS challenges was after the 2010 census. Allison and I participated in that in 2007 and 2008. The data center helped help the city challenge the population estimates. We got 50,000 extra people added the first year and 25,000 the second year. But the methodology was more flexible back in that decade. And the Bureau really clamped down after 2010. And so you can see the number of successful challenges just drops to almost nothing after 2010. And again, the yield is very small after 2010. Really, I think what we're seeing on the left-hand side with those high bars is that consultants got really good at sort of working the system. That's probably what that is an indicator of than actual need to, whether numbers were actually changed because they needed to be changed. So with that, are there any questions? So Bob asks, could a special census be conducted in a sub area? Yes, so that was actually the case with that Washington, Illinois. They wanted to do a special census in a specific area, and just for a subset of their population of 15,000, it was going to be $114,000 to do. And you still have the same problem. You run the risk of perhaps even getting a lower count than you had the first time around, just because you don't have the momentum of all the census messaging behind your count. Any other questions before I hand it off to Chris? Okay, Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Denice. Great to be here, everyone. As Kathy noted, I'm Chris Dick. I used to be a statistician and a branch chief in the estimates area at the Census Bureau. And I also spent a good amount of time running a public sector practice for a company called Civis Analytics, where we were helping state, local, federal government to better use data to solve a lot of their problems. And now I'm really focused on consulting around uses of census data and ensuring that we have good advocacy around census data. So one of the, what I really want to do here is I want to take a step back from what Denice was just talking about, because super excited that all of you are here, that you're all interested enough in actually thinking about pop estimates already when, we don't even have a redistricting file yet, and we don't even have the DHC yet. But I do want to talk just a little bit to make sure to level set on exactly what are the population estimates? Why do we care? How are they used? So in general, the population estimates, if the year doesn't end in 0, these are the data that have you covered. So this is the official measure of the population in all of those years. So all of those intercensal years, this is where it gets confusing. All of those intercensal years are when the post-censal estimates are the official population numbers for the United States. I can nerd out also about the difference in post-censal and intercensal estimates if people really want to. They're also key in weighting for the American Community Survey and so many of the other surveys that we all know and love, such as the CPS, the AHS, SIP, so many more that we could add here. They're the basis for our school district, health insurance, income and poverty estimates. I don't know if folks also just saw relatively recently, the same small area group that puts out these school district health insurance estimates also put out some community resiliency estimates, new measures that seem really, really cool. I'm gonna check the chat here, sorry. Allison, I love it. This also underlies many of the key data that are used for our federal funding applications. And that's why a lot of us care here on this call, right? This is over $1.5 trillion per year. And even, regardless of if those funds are actually put out there by ACS measures or POP-S measures, the POP estimates are influencing that. It also drives state bonding authorities. And finally, compared to a census or the American Community Survey, any other areas, they're extremely cost effective to produce. So in areas where perhaps the Bureau needs more money to focus more on the quality of the POP estimates, the lift that we can get through greater funding for that particular area is the return on investment per dollar is much higher. Oh, I clicked off the screen. So why do we care? And why do we care right now? And then why do we care in the future? There are two real reasons, right? So the first one, and this is something that's a little new this decade, is we can actually have comparisons to the 2020 census as one of the many quality measures. This isn't really the focus of this presentation, but I'm gonna go over it anyways because a lot of people are talking about it. Also, there are a lot of downstream impacts on other data products. And frankly, a lot of people use these directly as well in their work. I remember using the population estimates. I'm gonna go to a natural disaster example as well, Denice. When I was working down in Houston after Hurricane Harvey, trying to actually use commercial data to understand who was impacted, and had to basically throw out the whole project of using commercial data because the data were so poor for such a diverse area like Houston. We had to go back to the POP estimates, the ACS, and then other derived products like the Social Vulnerability Index. Check the chat here to make sure No. Thanks, Kathy. I always just want to make sure I'm answering questions as we go here. So feel free to speak up if you have any. But to really understand why, we have to first take a step back and really understand how these population estimates are created. So how are they developed? Population estimates really start out with the census as the base. This is where not only the redistricting file, but frankly that DHC, our characteristics file, are going to be incredibly important. So the starting population is the census base. As Denice noted, if there are issues in the census base, there are a few ways to fix it, and that's what we're going to get to here in the future. But CQR is one of them. There are other programs that also update the base each year, namely the boundary and annexation survey. So, if your boundaries are changing, that is implemented into the estimates base. We then look at measures of population change. This is administrative and survey data. It's done yearly for different levels, and we'll talk about this in a second. For different levels, different pieces of data are used. But then we get an ending population, and this is the July 1 population for each of those years that don't end in 0. So what data are we actually using? And this all becomes very important when we start talking about what a pop estimates challenge is. For the county level and above, so for counties, states, and the nation, we're using that base, that census base, and then we're adding in births, we're subtracting deaths, we're using IRS filings and Medicare data to calculate domestic migration between areas. We're using the American Community Survey and other country census data to calculate international migration. This is something that I spent a lot of time really thinking about when I was at the Bureau. And then we're using something called the Group Quarters Report, which is something that all of your friendly federal state cooperative for population estimates members, which each state has one, submits to the Bureau each year. So this is change in the group quarters population year over year. Okay. So the Bureau starts out creating the county and above estimates. They then they have county controls. They know what the population is at the county level. Now they can start looking at cities and towns. So the way that the Bureau creates these estimates is something called the distributive housing unit approach. So they're using building permits. They're using data from the survey of construction, so completes and non-permitted construction, manufactured home survey, the American Housing Survey. They're using local building permits, mobile home placements, demolitions. There's a ton of different data that they're using. And again, even at this low level, they're using group quarters report data. But they're using one other thing too. And this, again, gets very, very important when we talk about the challenge process. For each of these pieces of geography, the estimate is actually controlled back up to the county total. So one of the things that happened past 2010, that wasn't the case before 2010. So in the 2000 decades, this was not the case, is you could challenge a sub-county estimate, but you couldn't change the county total unless you challenged the actual county estimate. So we'll get into that in a moment. So where exactly do pop estimates fit when I'm talking about kind of that stream of kind of data assets that we're talking about? They really sit in between the decennial census and all the survey products that a ton of people use. So if we don't have a good decennial census, the population estimates aren't going to be good. There's just no way. That is the base of the population estimates. Even if we do have a good decennial census, if we don't have a good pop estimates program, we're not going to have good surveys. So that decennial census, actually going out and counting the people, we obviously can't do it every year. That's why we have the pop estimates program. But without the pop estimates program and without that decennial census, we can't have representative surveys. So let me do a quick aside, because a lot of people are talking about this, and I frankly just don't want people to get it wrong when they're talking about using pop estimates as a measure of census quality. So historically, when we talk about measures of census quality, we're really talking about a few different things. We're talking about demographic analysis, we're talking about post-enumeration surveys, and we're talking about looking at operational metrics and data. So not to spend too much time on this, but demographic analysis is a almost fully independent measure of the population on April 1. You're using administrative data, births, deaths, international migration, and surviving the population forward, and then comparing that to the census. Post-enumeration surveys are surveys that use a different frame and go back out and actually resurvey the population to get at errors and omissions. And then operational metrics and data, something really great the Bureau has done this decade, is release a ton more of these data at much lower levels of geography. But even with all of this, given everything that happened in 2020, we just don't have enough information to really be looking at quality without trying to actually use population estimates. And there's a reason for this. Number one, demographic analysis is an incredibly strong program, but you only get it at the national level, and it's only for a very small number of race and ethnic groups. So for instance, you can get Black, non-Black. That is what you get in national DA. You can get, for the under 29 population, you can get Hispanic, non-Hispanic. That's it. So you really can't have a good quality discussion around demographic analysis for, say, the Asian population. You just can't do it. Post-enumeration surveys are also great, but they don't come out until much later after the census, so they're not helping us right now. And then operational metrics and data are fantastic, but if you have an operational metric that doesn't look good, what are you comparing the number against for the actual final census to say, well, that poor operational metric actually led to a poor outcome? So that's where population estimates can come in, and where I think a lot of people are wanting to use them. But I do want to have a couple of pieces of caution. So we can use the estimates to compare to the 2020 census. You just have to remember that any differences between the population estimates and the census, it's not 100% clear on where the error comes from. So we have the vintage, what they call it, what the Bureau calls the vintage 2020 population estimates. These are post-census estimates that are built with the 2010 census as a base, and then using all of those components of change. Well, if we see differences, and this was a big comparison when the state apportionment numbers came out, if we see differences between the state population estimate and the state apportionment count, where could the error come from? Well, the error could be in the 2020 census, the error could have been in the 2010 census, or the error could have been in the estimation of the components of change for population estimates. Really, one of the big pushes that I have for people who are trying to use this as a comparison is to bring this together with other data sources like the operational metrics and other things that happen on the ground, like natural disasters, perhaps, to really understand everything that's happening. And you're still not going to have a perfect outcome in terms of that comparison of quality, but you're going to have more information than if you just use one data source. And then I just wanted to note, because this is, again, something really cool the Bureau is doing. They're really getting ahead of a lot of the questions that a lot of us have, is the Census Bureau, usually to not confuse data users, does not often directly release the vintage that ends in 0 of the population estimates in the year that they would normally happen. So in the year that ends in 1. Because the census is being released and the pop estimates are not the official number anymore, and they don't want to confuse people by having too many different data sources. But given the fact that the census wasn't going to be released on time for when it normally would be, and given all of the concerns about quality, the Bureau got ahead of this and actually decided to release the population estimates for all of us to use as comparisons, and also to have a July 1, 2020 number in the interim before the census is released. So the Census Bureau released these as evaluation estimates. They usually do this a couple years later when they go and evaluate how their estimates did versus the census. But they're releasing them on a pretty normal schedule this year, but they're a little harder to find. So I included a link here for everyone to be able to use, and I'm sure we'll be sending the slides out after this as well. So just a couple key dates, and we're almost to the last one now. On May 4th, the Bureau released the national, state, and county totals and the components of change for the POP estimates. On May 27th, they released the city and town population and the national, state, and county housing unit estimates. And coming up next week, they're releasing the national, state, and county demographic files. So these will be really, really useful, not only when we have the apportionment data, but the national, state, and county demographics would be great when we get that demographic characteristics file. The other thing that I have heard, one of the charts that we had earlier was actually from something the Census Bureau published when the apportionment numbers came out. They had a little paper comparing the POP estimates and DA to the apportionment numbers. They're not going to be able to do that for the PL data, for the redistricting data, because the timeline is just too quick. But the thing they will be doing is re-releasing all of these data sources with an April 1 date instead of a July 1 date, so that people can do their own comparisons. So that would be very, very useful. Okay, so before I jump into the challenge process and why we're really here today, does anyone have any questions on that so far? I see a few things in the chat here. Aprilized data, I love it. Liz asked, okay, differential privacy. Boy, that's a whole can of worms with everything.
Another webinar. But I
So,
thought that it was going to apply,
yeah.
but you can say, I was going to check with the you.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, it will be impacted by differential privacy. The long answer is it's kind of going to be impacted on the front end and the back end, maybe, right? So the use of the base, they might have to use the base that already has differential privacy applied to it, and then apply differential privacy to their estimates. So like that is a potential outcome. But I think some of that is still being figured out, at least the last time that I talked to some of my friends and former colleagues at the Bureau. I don't know, Denice, do you have anything newer on that from any of your discussions?
Nope, that's what I'm hearing too. But I think the silver lining there is that your former colleagues in the POP-S division are really, like, they're very much aligned with the rest of us data users in terms of what they want out of the demographic and housing characteristics file. So we have very strong advocates for quality, complete data inside the Bureau.
Yes, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, they really want to create high quality population estimates. And if they feel like they're not getting the products they need to be able to do that, they'll kick and scream about it in a very polite way. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the challenge process. So first of all, let's just define what the challenge process is. Population estimates program has a mechanism for dealing with errors in their methodology and data, and it's called the challenge process. It allows certain entities, and we'll talk about who those are, to officially challenge the population estimates for a given vintage. And then those changes are incorporated in future vintages as well, given certain criteria and rules. The program is suspended and then restarted each decade. I know Denice had that in her slide above. And with the suspension and restart each decade, there are often also changes to the rules in the program. So what are the rules? What are the rules right now? What have they been in the past? As of the suspension of the program in the beginning of 2020, so the last vintage that could be challenged was the vintage 2019 estimates in 2020, vintage 2018. And then they were stopped in 2020 so that 19 couldn't be challenged. The challenge rules were as follows. The only people who could challenge were the highest elected official for an impacted jurisdiction. This could include a highest elected state official, highest elected city official, highest elected county official. At the end of the day, I don't think I've ever seen a state challenge. I don't know if highest elected official there really means much for this program, but we have seen counties and cities and towns do challenges. What can be challenged right now? The methodology could not be challenged in the 2020 decade. challenges had to use the same methodology as the Census Bureau used. So, what this ended up meaning was the method by which the population estimates were calculated. So at the county and above level, this is the cohort component method. Below the county level, this was the distributive housing unit method. Those were not, that actual methodology wasn't challenged, but you could challenge the inputs to that methodology. So data sources and data errors were challengeable this last decade. This includes limited ability to use alternative data sources as long as their quality and the timestamp of the data could be validated. So one thing that I've seen people do is use things like electrical hookups instead of building permits to show occupied housing. The key is, though, they needed to be able to provide that for their whole jurisdiction, and they needed to be able to show that it was as of the same date as whatever data they were trying to replace. And then the timing. All challenges, as Denice noted, must be made within 90 days of data release. So this is very, very quick. Most local jurisdictions really need to have their data ducks in a row to be able to actually use this program. So what happened between the 2000s and the 2010s? And I'm just going to agree with Denice here because I was at the Bureau during the time we were making decisions about how to change the challenge process. And I think there was a view at the Bureau that there were a lot of consultants who had learned how to game the system, and we needed to stop letting people game the system because it was making the estimates lower quality. So the rules substantially changed between the 2000s and the 2010s. There are a bunch of papers on why it changed that came out of the estimates evaluation for 2010. But specifically, before 2010, people could actually challenge using alternative methodologies. That was a huge difference in the program. And a lot of people would. They would challenge a county level estimate using a using a housing unit method instead of cohort component. And importantly, one thing I didn't put on this slide, but that was really, really important, is the county control for sub-county areas could be overridden before 2010. So in the case of New Orleans or New York, they would actually be able to override some of those county controls. And why is this important? This is just an updated graph that Denice has already shown from the paper that Georgetown put out. The decrease in the number of accepted challenges was just insane between the 2000s and 2010s. I'd like to think a lot of this is due to improvements in estimates methodology. Some of that is just me being selfish and wanting to think that a lot of the improvements that I was hoping to put in really just made all of this happen. But I also think some of it is, frankly, perhaps a little bit of an overreaction on the Bureau's part to people trying to game the system. So what is different this decade, and why is there an opportunity to really influence this program? Again, as Denice noted, and as all of you know, the 2020 census was different. It was a little rough for folks in the Bureau and for all of us watching and also trying to advocate around it. The first thing that happened is something that's just continued, right? Continued historical declines in trust in government and trust in institutions, and therefore in self-response specifically. But then, we had this little pandemic that made things a little tougher. Politicization of the census was very, very rough. Natural disasters in many areas, the hurricanes, the fires, and so many other issues. And as we talked about through this presentation, this has caused cascading impacts on so many other programs, including the population estimates. So one thing I want to note here is the folks in the estimates program are getting ready right now to start their production of the next vintage of population estimates that have to be released. They're releasing estimates right now, but then usually a month later, they start actually working on the estimates for next year. They're not going to have an estimates base to start with that will be at 100% the 2020 census. So this has caused them to have to do something called working on a blended estimates base, which is going to use some data sources from 2020, a lot of data from the base from 2010, as well as some other administrative data that they wouldn't normally use for the population estimates base. The reason this is important is it opens another door for us to really think about and talk about. So I'm going to get to that in a moment. What happens next? This is a really, really great time, even though it's very early, to be talking about the population estimates challenge process, because there's still time for us to really be soaking this in and thinking about advocating for how the program can change. But we still need to learn a couple things. First of all, we need to know more about census quality, and that's really only going to come out through more operational metrics releases, the release of the PL data, and hopefully a relatively timely release of the demographic characteristics file. But we also need to know what happens with CQR, because CQR also has an impact on that estimates base, and anything that is fixed through CQR doesn't need to be fixed through any other program like population estimates challenges. As we learn more about these, we can really start helping to define what the population estimates challenge process should look like this decade. Each decade it should change because things on the ground actually change in terms of the base, but also in terms of data that exists to be used. A few things that I want all of you to be thinking about is, who do you think should be able to challenge? What do you think should be able to be challenged? And what can be used to challenge? What data sources? And then finally, how do we define high quality and timeliness? Because this is going to be incredibly important to convincing the Bureau that new data sources or new methodologies should be accepted. So what can you do now? What can you do in the future? I see a lot of potential roles for all of you. Starting now, really sharing some of this information with local governments about that opportunity to weigh in on ideas before the census sets these guidelines is incredibly important. In any way that I can help, that Denice can help there, please do let us know. We're willing to have in-depth conversations with any of you. Sorry, throwing you in there, Denice. I'm at least willing to have in-depth discussions with all of you. The next step is really going to be late this year. And that is going to be kind of either really late 2021 or in the start of 2022, the Federal Register notice for the population estimates program is going to come out. This is when you have a chance, or some of those local government officials have a chance to really comment on what the rules of the PopS Challenge program should be. And then going into the spring and summer of next year, there's really a big role for this group to share advice about methodology and data sources, given the rules that have been set by the Bureau. And then obviously, once folks can actually challenge, really helping to acquire and process some of those supplemental data would be incredibly helpful. I know a lot of you have, by the focus of your roles, are working a lot with local governments. I've done the same. We all know that different local governments have different levels of data ability and frankly, just resources to be able to do a lot of this work. They are going to need a lot of help. And frankly, the people who need it the most, the localities that need it the most, are probably going to have the least resources to do it. And that's where a lot of all of you and a lot of us can help. So I just wanted to kind of leave it there and open us up for a few questions. I see a couple chats in here, and let's see. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other. And I want to look at any of these questions. I'm going to try to go through there, but if other folks have questions, feel free to jump in.
I was being chatty, Chris.
That's all right. Thank you.
Just to give some context, Liz works at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Council, one of those C's.
You got it, commission.
Yeah, a regional council of governments organization.
Oh, Liz, that is a great question. This is actually, so if you go and look at the data that are available on who has challenged, one of the things you see is counties don't challenge very often. And this is actually because of exactly what you're bringing up, Liz. There aren't a lot of data sources that you can really challenge with. So first of all, most FSCP members are providing the most recent birth and death data before NCHS even has the ability to process and release the data to the Bureau. So the Bureau is always using birth and death data from NCHS that's 2 years old in their estimates, and then the FSCP gives the current year, the 1 year old data. So oftentimes those data are pretty good. That would be a very, very easy challenge, though, if it was not, if those data were not correct. For migration, domestic, I haven't seen someone do it. The only thing that I've seen, and I can't remember if this got through, I think it did, was I have seen someone challenge their international migration numbers. And it was someone who had refugee data and basically said, look, I know I have more net international migration than you're saying, because I know I have at least this many people in my town. There was a lot of back and forth with the Bureau, because what the Bureau actually releases is net international migration, just like net domestic migration. So it's very hard to then say, okay, but how many people left? How would you even answer that? They can't. I mean, frankly, the Bureau has a really hard time doing emigration estimates as well. Kathy, I think that's a really, really good point. You could use the IRS migration files, but again, you'd be using the same data that the Bureau is. And really, I think some of the big differences would be there. The IRS migration, it's gross versus net, which is what the Bureau does, and that gets very confusing. It's a very, very tough process in terms of doing domestic migration. I think this is where there are good discussions to be had about alternative data sources and different ways to do this. And I think this is, Denice, you and Allison, the work that you did after Hurricane Katrina, I think that's a really good example. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you all did then?
With the junk mail data?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I think everybody's probably heard this story about starting around 2008. The federal statistics still weren't kicking in to track population, so we used the Velasas data and of households actively receiving mail, and that ground truth pretty well for increasing populations, but less so for decreasing populations because of the lag that it takes letter carriers to remove an address from the list. So, and I think there's probably some private sector data if we wanted to get more creative, about cell phone data and other private sector data that could probably be more, yield more insights these days. Oh, thank you, Kathy. Yep.
So as we're thinking about this, and if folks are thinking, as they're thinking of questions, really, I think some of the opportunities that we really have here are opening up specifically different methodologies potentially for challenging, but also with this idea of the blended base, I think this is the only opportunity we've really ever had to say, look, if you're using different data sources other than just the Decennial Census for the estimates base, people should be able to challenge those components. So that, again, it's going to be complicated, but I think it is an opportunity we have, and one worth really thinking about for those of us who are using a lot of these local data sources all the time.
Chris, it seems to me like if they wanted to go, share information with their planning department, for example, who I feel like would be, I don't know, it seems like would be involved in the in data challenges, like they would need, like, not to put this pressure on you, but like an explain talking points, a one pager, basically your slides condensed into something that they would be able to hand to a agency official. Yep. Does something like that exist, or will it exist?
There is something like that I'm working on right now, so that I will definitely send it to this group.
We will be an excellent consumer. I think there'll be a lot of people that will be useful. I mean, obviously they can share verbally, pass on the information that you have, but there's a lot of expertise in there. A lot of
I think the one big thing I would ask is, number one, use it, please. But number two, please, any feedback that you're getting on it, either good or bad, I would love to hear, just so that we can make sure to continuously improve it. Because again, we do have a little bit of time on this, but you know, we want to iterate on this quickly so that we can ensure that these local officials are getting the information they need, and then all of you who are kind of the intermediaries between those folks are getting the information you need as well.
Chris, can you speak to the return on investment? We certainly, saw with count question resolution that it just wasn't worth it, clearly for most jurisdictions. And we also, have a feeling that that this census was much better for, Minnesota than it was Louisiana. And so, like, how would a jurisdiction decide whether it's worth it to try to challenge?
Yeah, and that is such a big question to really unpack, because the really annoying thing I'm going to say right here is it depends. And what it depends upon is what the rules are for this program. And that's why it's really important that we advocate for really improving the rules and ensuring that the rules are focused on having the highest quality population estimates, not on just, ensuring that people don't get the system. I think we need to get back to that middle ground. If that is the case, the real question becomes, how do we, let's say that we can challenge the base. Well, how do we know if the base is bad? And that's work that needs to be done, and work that, I hope to be doing some of, and I think a lot of you have the skill sets to do as well. But a lot of that is comparing the census to all these different metrics that are coming out, as well as the population estimates, to understand kind of the delta and where we likely have problems. And then really understanding what's at stake. And a lot of this has to do in terms of especially selling it to local jurisdictions in terms of if this is worth it or not, what the return on investment is really focused on federal funding. And while, maybe someone like, Andrew Reamer might smack me in the head for trying to simplify this, if you look at a few of the largest programs, and really look at kind of the cost of missing a person in the census and simplify it a little bit, I think there's a really big argument to be made there, where it's like, yeah, you miss a person, you're missing $1,000 a year in certain programs. I think was the case in Texas for the 2020 census. I think it was like $1,170 some. So it becomes pretty easy to actually make a return on investment case for these very specific use cases. And again, that's something as more data come out that I'll be trying to put explainers around. And again, I would love to share them as widely as possible. That's fair, Kathy. That's totally fair.
And we've had that conversation with Andrew. So with some of the people on this call, actually.
Yeah. Jesse, sorry, I'm reading your question here.
Jesse works for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council in Boston.
That is very interesting, Jesse. I had not heard that about permits for units built as part of adaptive reuse. That does seem like an issue. This is a question that I am going to actually ask a few of my friends in the POP-S program and see how much they know about this issue and if they have thoughts on it already. If not, I actually think that that's a pretty good argument for being able to work with your local jurisdiction to be able to challenge that piece of the estimates.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I mean, it could be like our state data center's interpretation of the guidance, but it's a pretty big issue, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I will say this is in general an issue. What you're raising here, Liz. I think if there is a weakness in the estimates program, it's building permit data. I'm just gonna say it. Building permit data are tough, and their quality across the country is kind of up and down. there are other issues where, for instance, things like vacancy or occupied units, depending on how you want to look at it, they don't change over the decade. It's a rate, and it's applied just from the decennial census. So if there were ways to challenge that, that would be probably useful as well. But the thing I will say is, back to Denise's question about return on investment, if the argument is that you can challenge, but you can never change the county control, it is often going to be the case that you're going to see changes that look a lot more like those CQR changes in terms of population change. Because you may add 200 housing units, all you're going to do is take a partial share of the county, and you're just going to take it away from the other people in the county who then are potentially going to challenge the next year because they're upset that they lost people. So.
And that does not change the flow of federal funding, right? As currently defined.
No.
So no more money, no extra money for the state.
Yeah. Yep.
Bob's asking a therapist question. I don't know if you're psychological.
So I will say, I have had a discussion before with a relatively large city who I think wanted to challenge because they wanted to move up in the rankings of the size of cities. And my big argument to them, frankly, when we had this discussion like mid-decade, was, look, you're going to challenge, and then the unincorporated areas around you in the county, or the incorporated areas in the county who are growing faster than you, likely have errors in their housing unit data. They're going to challenge next year, and they're going to actually take more away from you. So really think about this.
This has been great. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, I'll just offer to definitely stay in touch, Chris, and we're happy to help disseminate, and the folks that are interested to give more feedback and to share. We'll share the recording and the slides with the whole network. So I think we have, I don't know, we have 13 cities on, but we'll share it with the rest of them too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having us to chat with y'all.
Yeah, thanks.
Good. Thank you. See everyone later. If you have ideas of how to follow up, let us know, definitely.
All right. Adios.
Bye.
Bye.
Sarah J, we have two city partners. We have two partners that are actually in the city in Seattle and Charlotte. And then 3 regional area governments. 4, okay. Well, 3.5. Leah needs to work on getting Columbus in, but that went really well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, glad to do it. Thank you.